Seymour Hersh, author of The Price of Power. This morning's newspapers are full of stories about the Kissinger Commission on Central America meeting for the first time yesterday. What chances for success do you give it?
Well, you have to hope, of course, as any American would, that they come up with something wonderful. I think my experience has shown me that Henry Kissinger is ultimately a toady, and I think he's a very safe appointment. He's going to give you what you want. If Reagan wants a very tough, rattling the sabers of communists and geopolitical talk in Central America, he's going to get it. If Reagan wants an out, if he decides politically he needs a vehicle to get out, he can get a forward-looking report that says it's time to disengage. It all depends on what the boss wants. Whatever the boss wants, Henry Kissinger will deliver, is the general rule based on my experience. He could surprise us all. He could do something, you know, honest and with integrity. I don't think it's my experience. There's not very much in him. It's also my experience that his appointment, I think, is a message to the people of Central America and Latin America. Here's the man who basically in Latin America is viewed as the guy who brought down Allende, when Allende's crime in their eyes, his basic crime, was not his political Marxism or his socialism, but the fact they viewed us as being upset about the fact that he was elected by the people. A socialist was elected. He's the man who helped Nixon bring down Allende, and his chief deputy, Mr. Schlotterman, was a deputy chief of mission for the American embassy in Chile, Santiago, in 1970, at the time when we know from the Senate Intelligence Committee that there were, from an official report, that there were serious plans to have a military overthrow. So it's a terrible message to give the people. But it's very hard to read Henry Kissinger. My own private guess is he could even do something with Castro. He may pull a rabbit out of the hat. Anything is possible.
Seymour Hersh was born in Chicago, Illinois in 1937. Married, has 3 children. Spent 4 years researching and writing The Price of Power, Kissinger in the White House. This book, very big, thick book, as a matter of fact. Expensive book. What's this retail for?
$19.95, but in the modern day world it could have been more. I ended up taking a smaller commission on each book to get the price under $20, because it priced out at if anybody cares, it priced out at around $22, $23, which everybody said that's too expensive for. You can't sell serious books these days. So what Crown Books and some of the discount book stores sell it for $12, $13, which is almost a rational price.
Among other things, you currently are writing for this magazine on a regular basis. This is the August issue of The Atlantic, The Pardon, Nixon, Ford, Haig, and the Transfer of Power. What's so far been the most important impact that you think this book has had on the political process, if any?
Well, certainly I didn't know when I started I'd end up being an employment agency for Henry Kissinger. I mean, that certainly wasn't the goal, and if you think I'm happy about it, you know I'm not. I'm very upset that Reagan would, in the face of a book, for all the criticism of the book, it mostly is personal. It's the criticism has to do with whether I did a hatchet job, whether I'm obsessed with Henry Kissinger, whether I should be spending my time doing other things, and nobody's ever gone in and taken a chapter and opened it up and said I'm wrong, or talked to the people I talked with and get them to acknowledge that I was misquoting them. So there's no question that there's some serious issues that I've raised in the book, and then for Reagan, about morality, about integrity, about what the secret policy was. And for Reagan to come back and reappoint him says an awful lot. Is it anti-intellectual? Is it sort of sticking it? Or is it the fact that, hell, if Henry Kissinger can sell Richard Nixon's foreign policy as well as he obviously did, maybe he can sell mine. I think it must be a lot of that. He needs a good salesman. I think the most important thing in the book, as I've been flogging this book for a couple of months. It's been published in June, and I've been talking on talk shows and doing things. I didn't write this, but it's finally come to me the way I should have described what they really tried to do, Nixon and Kissinger. I think it was the most serious attempt at our Constitution in our history. I think these two guys were bringing everything into the White House. As we know, they were taking all of the authority away. Their real enemies were not the Chinese or the Russians with whom they could cut deals, but their Secretary of Defense, Mel Laird, and their Secretary of State, Bill Rogers. And the goal was to bring all the power in there. We know Nixon, when he was knocked down because of Watergate, was in the process of setting up his apparatchiks in every cabinet. If you remember that, Fred Malloch was running some sort of a program designed to get a certain kind of personnel in every cabinet and every executive regulatory agency, etc. I think the goal was almost total control, and I think his legacy was going to be his heir was going to be John Connolly, and I think Nixon's goal was to go out and have a $40 million a year law practice and be able to fix anything for anybody anywhere in the world. Well, we won't know the whole story of some of the money manipulations because I couldn't find it. I could find it, but I couldn't write it. I mean, I was too jittery about it. I had a wonderful book on foreign policy, but I learned a lot. The pardon story, for example, is something I learned in doing interviews. I did more than 1,000 interviews for this book, and I learned that there was no way Richard Nixon thought he was ever going to jail. He knew, you know, what Jerry Ford was and who Jerry Ford was. We just don't always.
Let me interrupt just to ask you, and I read the Atlantic story yesterday, and I wondered, why would somebody like former President Ford talk to you when he knows undoubtedly where you're coming from on this thing? Why would he sit down and he gave you an interview, what, out in Rancho Mirage or someplace?
Yeah, well, I think he initially did not want to, and he was talked into it by friends who said, you know, my God, you've got to see him. He initially said he's just going to, I think it was wise for him to talk to me because at least I'm right there saying he denies what he denies. I certainly didn't learn anything I didn't expect to learn. But I thought it was important. I think it's important for a former. I think they have an obligation to talk to people like me and escape. You know, Richard Nixon certainly wouldn't deign to see me, or doesn't deign to see very many people he doesn't think are friendly. Henry Kissinger didn't even deign to respond to a request for an interview. You know, the utter contempt with which my requests were cheated.
In a way, though, doesn't it help you in the sense of, you know, it's easier for you to say now, Mr. Kissinger won't see me, he won't talk to me, and there's a confrontation there that develops.
Well, I wish he had seen me because, you know, he likes to talk. You know, he's really his own worst enemy. His memoirs were my interviews. He has these two very fat memoirs. One of the things I allege in this Atlantic piece is that there was serious talk about bringing out the 82nd Airborne in the weeks before Nixon resigned. Al Haig was going around talking about the 82nd Airborne.
And you mentioned something about one of was it the chairman of the Joint Chiefs or one of the chiefs thought he heard in a discussion they were going to do that?
Well, one of the chiefs, after a meeting with Nixon in the December of '73, walked out of that meeting convinced that Nixon was giving him the high sign to do something, you know, that he was talking about, I'm your last hope, the Eastern liberal establishment, you know, are going to, those Jews in the East, they're going to run us over, and it's going to be the end of the programs you're for, good conservative, tough programs were going to be overrun by the left. And he thought he detected a high sign. That may have been in his own mind. He asked Jim Schlesinger, who was then the Secretary of Defense, and Schlesinger didn't hear it. But Schlesinger later was among those very alarmed when there was talk about the 82nd Airborne. And you know where you find proof of that? It's amazing. You find proof of it in none other than Kissinger's memoirs. You know, he wrote 3,000 pages. A lot of people bought it. Nobody read it. I have the same feeling about my book. You know, people buy it, but it's hard to read.
Have you found anybody that's read it cover to cover?
Yeah. You know, my wife. You know, no, I don't find... I'm very disappointed in newspaper reviews, and I don't know why I shouldn't be. I've been generally treated very favorably by the press. I really have been. I have no complaint, given Kissinger's status. But they really don't, you know... I was press secretary for G. McCarthy when he ran against Lyndon Johnson. One of McCarthy's lines that always struck me as very apt, funny, but also more apt than people realize. He said, the trouble with you reporters is, he said, is you write but you don't read. And we do have that. I mean, there's not enough, it seems to me, thoughtful stuff that goes on in the media, which makes it possible for a guy like me to make money. And the point I'm making is in somewhere in the middle of his second volume, towards the end of Kissinger's second volume of memoirs, I think Years of Upheaval, he describes a meeting in which Haig says we're going to have to bring out the 82nd Airborne to protect the president. And he writes about how we thought he was upset, et cetera, et cetera. Kissinger told Haig, whatever, you know, who can believe that? But I certainly can believe the first part. And it's pretty amazing stuff. Somewhere in one of Kissinger's, in Nixon's memoirs, RN, for those who have it at home, page 600, he has a diary entry in the middle of the Vietnam War. And it's 72, and they're trying to negotiate a settlement in Vietnam. You remember there was a Christmas bombing, there was all this agony, all this angst. And he has Haig coming in, Kissinger's off negotiating in Moscow. This is in April. And Nixon's mad at Kissinger, as he always was by 72. They ended up being terrible enemies. And they still are, although they had lunch the other day together. I mean, they hate each other, but, you know, they're They both developed into our finest actors. I mean, they're both wonderful actors, Nixon and Kissinger. They defeat anything much better than anything we have in Hollywood. They're two consummate actors. Both deserve all sorts of Oscars. But anyway, the point of it is on page 600, there's a diary entry. Nixon has this diary that he taped. He didn't transcribe regularly, but eventually he got them all transcribed for his memoirs. And the entry goes on like this. There's an issue up for debate about what they're going to negotiate with the North Vietnamese. And Haig comes in, and Haig says, Mr. President, above all, no matter what happens, we must do something that keeps you in office. You know, there it is. You rarely see it so clearly. Just sitting there like a lump, which is, you know, when I saw it, I went manna, because by that time, that's it. That's the whole game.
Cy Hersh, author, journalist, becoming one of the more loved and hated of the national journalists. Does it bother you when somebody really, and we're going to get calls this morning, I guarantee you, that people don't like you. Does that bother you? Or do you think that's part of the game?
Yeah, well, I did the My Lai stuff, and I did the My Lai massacre stuff in 70 or 69 when I wrote about the massacre of all those Vietnamese civilians and children. What bothered me were the calls for about 3 months. Anytime a bunch of special forces guys got together at one of the bars down in Georgia or somewhere and had a few beers while they got to the payphone, I'm enlisted, called me up and told me what they were going to do to my private parts. And so after that didn't get me nervous as much as it did my wife. And no, I don't like it. I don't like. I weep and moan at all the. I get some wonderfully nasty reviews. Some are very funny. In fact, National Review magazine, Bill Buckley's magazine, Vic Gold, who used to work for Agnew, wrote a terribly funny review. I mean, eviscerating me, but it was funny, you know. Gee, too bad you don't, you know, Seymour, how long can you live in the 60s and 70s, you know? Gee, this guy Nixon, he's bad, but he's not Hitler. You won't be able to make a living on him the rest of your life.
We, you know, normally look at the morning newspapers, and we will this morning. However, we want you to get ready to talk to Cy Hersh. Our 4 lines from the east are already lighted without even putting the numbers on the screen hardly, and the one from the west, which means you're anxious, so we'll go ahead and take a call and catch up on the newspapers as we go. I might point out that in this morning's newspapers that the Kissinger panel story is buried in all of them. I was just surprised personally. To show you, it was on page 3 in the New York Times. Kissinger panel meets for the first time. A picture of the panelists. Most stories, without going into detail, reflect what appears to be some dissension among the conservatives are upset about Carlos Diaz Alejandro because they say he was Cuban-born, he's close to Castro. Mike Barnes, a congressman from the suburbs of Washington, is critical and saying he's not going to be, you know, buffaloed in this. Bob Strauss saying, who is a Democrat, most of these are Democrats. Is this thing going to blow up in Kissinger's face?
No, he's awfully good at that stuff. I mean, this is, you know, what struck me about Kissinger when he first was announced, the appointment was announced, he had a press conference at the State Department. And the bit that really got everybody's eye, that made all the networks and much of the local television coverage I saw, was his call for a moratorium on dissent. Well, he said, we must have a time of quiet. He said, so we can reconsider the policy. These are serious moments. And, you know, I hate to say it, but the first thing he did when he became National Security Advisor to Nixon was to tell everybody we need 6 months for the war in Vietnam. The first thing he wants to do is always cut off the First Amendment. that's the first thing. Let's just cut this First Amendment stuff out. You guys in the press, let's just have a time of reflection. And when you make that appeal to a guy like Bob Strauss, you're going to win. You're going to get it. You're going to get the national security argument by him, and he's going to end up. Kissinger's great skill, I think, is in his ability to. The staff I noticed is very much his staff. In the Post this morning, there was an article describing one of the consultants as being Winston Lord, the chairman of the Council of Foreign Relations, one of his old boys from the old days. And it seems to me that his great skill, if I've done anything, I've probably made it riskier for him in terms of his ability to manipulate people, because they might be more sensitive to the fact that they're manipulated, and that's probably a plus.
Cy Hersh, our first call is from Boise, Idaho this morning. Good morning. You're on the air.
Good morning, Brian. This is Bill.
Yeah, Bill.
I'm a regular watcher. I get up, well, it's just after 7 here, and I get up and watch regularly, but and I've tried to call in before. I enjoy your program very much, and I get a lot of my news out of it.
Good. Do you get the Idaho Statesman in the morning?
No, I don't take it.
Okay.
I just wanted to make a comment. I heard Mr. Hersh make a statement or I read part of his book, excerpts, but not all of it. And I just want him to know that it's guys like him that I think should be shipped out. I agree with you completely. He's either greatly loved or greatly hated, and I, for one, am not at all a fan of Mr. Hersh and his ilk.
When you say shipped out, what do you mean by that?
Well, I think Havana would be a good stop for the first stop.
Well, what do you object to the most?
Huh?
What do you object to the most in Mr. Hersh? So we lost him. Well, he made his point.
Havana.
Havana. What do you say to people like that?
Well, I think most people, with all due respects to the gentleman in Idaho, understand I'm not a communist. And, in fact, I'm quite a very happy capitalist, and this is a great capitalist adventure.
I heard you admit that you got a tremendous advance on this, and you've talked about the money part of it. Do you make a lot of money off something like this?
You could. I haven't yet. I mean, but basically, the reason I'm so quick to talk about it, I want everybody to understand that it's not the total obsession that a lot of people seem to think it is. You know, Hersh is obsessed with Kissinger. I was very critical of Kissinger and his policies when I worked at the New York Times. That is, I wrote critical stories about him. Not even personally critical. I just wrote stories that put him in a bad light because the facts put him in a bad light. I guess I should say that I didn't want to do the book particularly until somebody threw an awful lot of money at me and said, this is a book to do, and here's enough money, you know, $250,000, leave the New York Times and do the book. And that's how I happened to do the book. I don't know what Fidel Castro would make of it, but the fact is that I'm very sorry. But, you know, I'll tell you my attitude, sir, again, with all due respects. I have as much right to be here as you do, buddy. And it's my country as much as yours, and I have as much right to make what my views known as you do. I'm sorry you hung up. Would have loved to have talked to you. But you better understand something, that even when I was a very sharp critic of the Vietnam War in early days, when I was covering the war for the AP, and I really began to hate the war, I always thought that that it was as much my country as it was the generals. And it is. And there's no reason for anybody to back down at any point about what you think in this country.
Cleveland, you're on with Cy Hersh. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Mr. Hersh, the only thing I can say about your book, because I haven't read it, is that I think the reaction to it is just hilarious. Seems to be that the liberals are the ones that hate it so much, so you must have attacked one of theirs, which is what conservatives have been saying for years. Now, what I want to talk to you about is your speech in front of the Platform Association. You said that personal integrity is the sine qua non in government, and then you went on to say that LBJ would have been our greatest president if it hadn't been for Vietnam, which to me is just an incredible thing to say in the face of Robert Caro's book about LBJ, but perhaps you have a sort of a double standard here, and I'd like you to maybe answer this for me about John F. Kennedy and his integrity. In the light of his bringing what Mike Royko called bimbos into the White House for his, quote, back therapy, end quote, his ordering the overthrow of the Diem brothers, which I think you know he did, and I'd like to know how you think he did it, and the wiretapping of Martin Luther King, and the involving of the mafia, perhaps through his and Giancana's mutual paramour, to assassinate Fidel Castro.
Okay, a lot on the plate. Thanks for the call.
Let me just answer. Of course, I didn't say that about John Kennedy, whose presidency is terribly overrated for a lot of reasons. I'll give you some more reasons. Some of the words he brought into our national vocabulary: nation building, counterinsurgency, Green Berets, fortified hamlets, strategic hamlets, all of these words in Vietnam that frankly led to an awful lot of trouble. And I don't believe for a second that he would have backed out of Vietnam. I think he was committed to that mistake as much as anybody. My point about Johnson was this, that of all the presidents, it seemed to me, Johnson had the closest and was the most. My remarks stem from a conversation I had with Claude Pepper, the congressman from Florida, and the senior citizen man who was sitting next to me on the dais. He had, it seemed to me, the most sense for poor people and for the downtrodden, Lyndon Johnson. I don't know whether it was, we'll wait. Carol's book is marvelous, by the way. It makes every other's biography a joke. Carol isn't up there yet. He's only up to the 50s or the 40s with Lyndon Johnson. He's not into the Senate yet, even. He's got 2 more volumes. But I do think he had a real touch, Lyndon Johnson, in terms of a basic sort of understanding of what it felt to be poor, and what black people and poor white people really felt, and Hispanics. I do believe that, and that's what I was talking about, and there's no way I'm going to change that. On the foreign policy stuff, he was terrible.
What about quick comment on the accusation about the Kennedy Mafia connection?
Oh, well, I don't think there's any question. If she's talking about, I'm not sure, ma'am, but the one thing we do know is that Kennedy's, in that administration, we can't quite get it to Jack Kennedy, but he had to know about it. There was an attempt made through the Mafia to assassinate Fidel Castro using Sam Momo Giancana, whose girl was one of the bimbos that Mike Rocco talked about that ended up in the White House, one of his girlfriends. Anyway, the point is that Kennedy certainly was, if that's the contact you're talking about, there certainly was a connection between the CIA and the Mafia.
Your favorite president in the last 20 years?
Ike, in terms of morality.
San Diego, good morning.
Hello.
You have the Union there?
Pardon me?
You have the San Diego Union with you this morning?
No, they're not.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm a political science student at the University of California at San Diego. And this summer I took a class with a Professor Cannella at UCSD. In that class, we basically took Kissinger, the White House years, his first memoirs, and Seymour Hersh's book, and did a review with them. And I have basically two questions.
Let me ask you, before you ask the questions, what did you think of both books?
Well, each book by themselves, they were very interesting books.
Did you reach any conclusion about Cy Hersh's book? Did you think it was an honest book?
Well, that's part of, well, as an honest work, that's one of the questions, because it's a question that he probably is familiar coming from the New York Times book review digest. And yeah, it's an honest book, but it's got a difficulty in that you have a disposition towards one thesis that comes out in the end, and he uses sources that will basically reiterate that thesis. He talks about 1,000 interviews, but one of the jabs at it by the New York Times was that those are all people that were political losers to Kissinger.
Okay,
What's your question, Ray?
Review from those people as far as in their interviews.
Okay, what's the question?
The question is, what interviews substantiated Kissinger's stuff? When you have all these interviews that basically are negative towards Kissinger, as a journalist, do you not need also other evidence to weigh against that to actually make that credible? And second of all, there's a big disparity in events sometimes in the book, and actually what it happens is that it makes it harder to be able to say, yeah, Mr. Hersh is correct about this, or yeah, he's wrong about this. There's like just a small event within, reading the two books. You have, in Kissinger's book, just at the very beginning, he talks about his acceptance as National Security Council advisor. And it talks about how Kissinger says he goes through a long ordeal about getting, because Nixon basically didn't like to talk very much, not getting offered the job until later, taking a week to decide, and then finally deciding. And Mr. Hersh says that he actually contacted the Nixon campaign to get the appointment and accepted it right away. And when you see things like that, how do you tell which is correct?
Okay. Let me give you a reference. Go to the New York Times, I think June 11th. It's a Monday. It would be the 10th or 11th or 12th. I think June 11th, 1983. My book was published. Most of the initial news reports was on the fact that I wrote that Kissinger had approached both Humphrey and Nixon in '68 looking for a job, sort of hat in hand, academic credentials in hand, saying, here's what I can do for you. And I also made a very serious allegation that he had approached Nixon with information, inside information he had learned as a consultant to the peace process in the Lyndon Johnson administration. Although he worked for Rockefeller as a foreign policy advisor, he's a very bright, competent guy. He'd been used by the Johnson administration as a consultant on Vietnam. And he threw that information over to Nixon, whatever he could learn about the peace process. It was this that led Kissinger, initially when my book was first published in June, to denounce the book as a pack of slimy lies. The Times then, in getting to the question you just raised, who to believe, interviewed the people I interviewed. In the first chapter of my book, I quote Richard Allen, who was, in 1968, was Nixon's foreign policy advisor, later showed up as Reagan's national security advisor. I also had information from Zbigniew Brzezinski, although I did not quote him directly. He later did acknowledge that I had talked to him. I also had information from some of the Humphrey aides who described a letter Kissinger had written looking for a job in '68. Ted Van Dyke was his name, one aide in particular. And I talked to other people. The Times interviewed all these people who stood by their story. Kissinger initially told the Times it was a pack of lies. By the end of the story, he was saying, well, I don't recall. I don't recall those conversations. Brzezinski, in particular, did affirm that Kissinger had approached Brzezinski, who was then working for Humphrey, to offer his services or to help to offer favors. Allen acknowledged that he had, as I wrote, had offered inside information on the peace talks. I don't think there's much doubt if you go to the... I wish more newspapers would, and I'm delighted for your question. As for the question of talking to losers, you're referring to a comment from Stanley Hoffman, who reviewed, a Harvard professor who reviewed the book in the Sunday Times, and a long, serious review. One of the things he also said is that he ran through some of the allegations I made about foreign policy, and he said, on balance, he agreed with most of the assertions I made. I have to say that. But he did raise a couple of points, one of them being that I talked to the losers. Well, one of the problems is, with somebody like Henry Kissinger, there's always losers. There's nothing but losers. When the whole name of the game is to grab all the power, the people I talked with and quoted are people who are very prominent. Many of them are well-known. Mel Laird, certainly nobody can say, loser or not, that he's a dishonorable man. William Rogers, a former Secretary of State who was a loser. Nobody's ever accused him of being a liar. Because they're losers doesn't mean they're necessarily not telling the truth, and it also doesn't mean that I can't verify what they say. One of the people, Kenneth Rush, former ambassador to West Germany, an old friend of Richard Nixon. It seems to me if you focus just on terms of Hersh talked to losers, you're missing something, which is that I've been in this town for 25 years. I know a loser from a winner, and I understand that losers, because they're losers, often know a great deal and are more willing to talk. It's my function to verify what they say.
Price of power, Kissinger in the Nixon White House. Austin, Texas. Go ahead, please. You're on with Cy Hersh.
Hi.
Hi. You're on the air.
Hello.
Go ahead, please.
Well, basically, I just had two comments to make. I have not read Seymour Hersh's book, but about in Nicaragua, I think basically what I wanted to say is that for all the oppression that we hear on the media, how the leftist government there is very oppressive towards its people. I think that the main point that I would like to make is that the far left has no equivalent of the right-wing despot. And
second point.
The second point I would like to make is that for any solution to the Salvadoran conflict, there has to be a political power-sharing sort of arrangement to begin to control the far-right structure of government that we have in El Salvador today. And one last comment that I would like to make is that the Ronald Reagan presidency is from what I've been able to pick up from your discussion, there seems to be some similarities in for control of power that I find very, very scary. And
okay, thanks. I want to ask a follow-up to that gentleman's call. The Reagan administration, is it an honest, in the press operation in particular, are we getting honest information? This morning's paper has a story where the president disagrees with his Army Chief of Staff, General Wickham, that said that we weren't ready around the world in military affairs. Larry Speaks is quoted saying the president disagrees with that. What is that? Is that
I think,
is it a simple thing?
I think the Reagan administration is not the Nixon administration. Ronald Reagan is not as defective as Nixon. He's not as bright also and doesn't know as much. And there is something to be said in what was very scary about Nixon and Kissinger was how much they knew how bright they were and how crooked they were, really.
And the Reagan people aren't
no, they're very...
conniving?
Yeah, but they're normally conniving. They're not super winners like Nixon and Kissinger were. Nixon's been down and out for how long? You know, would you buy a used car from this guy who's been asked for 30 years now, and we still gave him 60% in 1972. What a wonderful job he did. If anybody had known the truth about Nixon in '72, in terms of the games he played with Kissinger, the wiretapping, the secret bombing of Cambodia, the activities against Ellsberg, the Allende stuff, the domestic spying, he wouldn't have been elected, but he managed to put a lid on it. To get to your question, this is the most ignorant government we've ever had, I think. I know, we've probably had some amazingly ignorant governments. This is just a government that really, we have a presidency that really, the president simply is not on top of issues. And the tragedy is we are in an operation in Central America in which intelligence isn't playing much of a role because it's all being manipulated, in which the president has made up his mind about what he wants to do, and that's what's going to happen. And it's very sad.
Oklahoma City, you're on with Cy Hersh. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Brian. I have been looking at C-SPAN for 26 months now. I've attempted to get in previously, but I just wanted to commend you and the staff for the fine job you're doing. Your coverage of journalism is such that it does provide an outlet that most of the channels do not have, especially the call-in shows.
Let me interrupt to ask you a question, because one of the things we talk about here is journalism with Cy Hersh, and he's been at the forefront of it. What is your feeling about journalists? If you've watched for 26 months, you've met more journalists than anybody else.
Well, I'm a member of the Sam Donaldson School. That is to say, I almost consider the world of journalism to be the fourth arm of government. That seems awfully far out to many people. It doesn't to me.
Do they do a good job?
I am interested in writing. I've done a little freelancing, but to me, it's become at this point in my life, I'm not young anymore, but I've just become interested in seeing that the truth is presented, at least as I perceive it. Veteran of a couple wars, I was down in Nam when the French were getting booted out, and I never thought that would happen, and it did. And whereas Ronald Reagan had a change from the liberal to the right late in life, I have had the effect of the last 20, 25 years has had just about the opposite effect upon me.
How about a question for Mr. Hersh?
For Mr. Hersh, the only thing I can say is that I haven't read it, The Price of Power. I read him when he's in Atlantic. That's another thing that the current administration has created for me. I've started reading more, and I've enjoyed his things in the Atlantic. I think he's a superb writer. I would only hope that in his wanderings and contacts around Washington, he can do much the same for the current administration that he has done for Mr. Kissinger.
All right, sir, thank you for the call. On the call from San Diego triggers a question for you. They use it in schools. When you're writing these things, what do you want? I mean, you work for Gene McCarthy. You obviously have a political gut reaction to the world. Do you want the book to have a political reaction, or do you want it to have a historical reaction? Or when you're writing a book like this, spending 4 years, what's it all about? Why are you doing it?
You want to sell books. Okay, that's one thing you want to do. I mean, you have to say that first. You want to write a book that's going to... It doesn't mean you change anything. This book could work because if done right, the analogy was I was standing on, I'm standing on a diving board jumping into a pool. I know I'm going to get wet. And I didn't know how bad it was when I signed the contract, but I knew if I did this book right, I would find things. Because Richard Nixon is a man of endless fascination for the United States. I didn't have any grandiose ideas. I really didn't think in... I was just too busy scrambling. I didn't think... it's going to be a book used in campuses a lot, and frankly, I'm delighted. I mean, I can tell, my publisher tells me that universities call up with orders, you know, reluctantly, because they don't like to order hardback books. But clearly it's going to be used in an awful lot of campuses, and I'm getting incredible mail. I'm getting a lot of mail. I mean, so much mail I get nervous about not being able to answer it all. And it's rational mail. I mean, people disagree with me. So clearly it's going to have an effect on colleges, and I hadn't thought about that. I had thought, you tell the story about this guy, and he's out there forever. I mean, you know, he's out of power. Keep him out of power. And let's just try and improve, I guess, in my Pollyanna way. If you ask me what I thought, I'm a good old-fashioned liberal Democrat. But you know something? One of the things I learned covering the Pentagon in the middle 60s is forget that business of left and right. You know, I said in the speech that was shown, whether it was all shown or not, I remember saying, it's not whether you're a liberal or a Democrat or a Republican or a conservative or a left-winger or a right-winger, it's whether you have personal integrity that matters. And my stories, clearly, all the stories I read about the CIA and about military stuff, I know a lot of military people. I know a lot of people in the intelligence community whose political views and personal views, some of the guys in the Pentagon who I used to deal with, we couldn't agree on a social issue if we stood on our heads. I mean, some of them were very racist. Some of the senior Navy officers, for example, West Point, Southern boys. But damn it, they had an incredible amount of integrity, and they couldn't stand what was going on, the lying they were doing in Vietnam. And they would come to me because at least they saw me as somebody that didn't betray a confidence, and whatever my personal views are, at least they knew where I was. I wasn't playing any games. I'm a liberal Democrat. I mean, I couldn't vote for Richard Nixon if I stood on my head. I don't think that's the issue. I'm still a professional journalist. And you know, we as journalists have to understand that we are entitled to have some rights. I mean, we can't walk around saying we don't have no politics. We all do. And it doesn't, that doesn't seem to matter very much. What matters is what we write. And you know, as I said earlier, somebody wants to criticize me by opening up a chapter and quoting people and saying they were misquoted or showing how I was wrong or showing, as that fellow in San Diego said, that the people I used were all terribly biased and dishonest sources who were losers in a bureaucracy, in a bureaucratic struggle. I think if somebody would do that, I'd just take off my hat and bow. But that's what needs to be done, it seems to me, rather than go around and talk about what my motives were, because what difference does it make? I'm a professional.
Cy Hersh, we go to Miami. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm Tom. I'm from Miami, Florida. And I'd like to ask Mr. Hersh if he ever picked up on any kind of, say, unofficial or ad hoc concern amongst congressmen at the potential for radical moves by Nixon and his people to seize power, you know, during the waning days of his administration. And by that I mean, you know, was there any contingency plan being developed by congressmen to head such a move off?
Well, I'm going to sell a copy of my magazine, The Atlantic, to you, because if you read it, in the middle of it, there's a long discussion of just what you're saying. There was a concern, not by congressmen, but by the Secretary of Defense, Mr. Jim Schlesinger, that something was afoot in the White House, and that basically he did a study of the 82nd Airborne and what forces would be available, and his concern was, to be perfectly honest, was that the Marines, who were very dominant in Washington, just in terms of the physical presence, there's a barracks here in southeast Washington, there's the Quantico training station about 30, 40 miles away. His concern was that the Marines, if Nixon asked them to do something, might stay loyal, even if he asked them to do something extra legal, on grounds that the Commandant of the Marines, General Cushman, had been a personal aide to Richard Nixon when Nixon was Vice President. And it's a pretty scary story. There I go. I'm selling a magazine. I don't think. I think if you're interested, you can get in touch with me through the Atlantic. They forward everything to me promptly.
By the way, point out that a gentleman we've been anxious to have on the program will be here Monday, Philip Taubman from the New York Times. The reason is that often on Monday morning, when the weekends are slow, Mr. Taubman has a major foreign policy story on the front page of the New York Times. It finds its way on the front pages of almost all the New York Times news service papers around the country, and we want to...
He's done some very good stuff on Central America.
Let's go to Jacksonville, Florida next for Cy Hersh. Good morning.
Mr. Hersh, I just wanted to ask you a question. In the past 10 or 12 years, events and investigations have revealed a pattern of the hiring of ex-CIA agents as consultants by the political campaigns, government agencies, and corporations. One that is most obvious is McCord and Associates, who were security consultants for the committee to re-elect the president, Richard Nixon, and more recently the Reagan campaign, Casey and his network of retired CIA agents, and the briefing book scandal. Would you care to comment on what this practice is doing to the American system, and would you possibly write an article about it?
Well, actually, I did. In '71, I took a break from my book, and I wrote a long series of articles for the New York Times Magazine on the Gaddafi connection, the two CIA agents, Ed Wilson and Frank Turple, who'd gone to work for Gaddafi, Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, and were training terrorists, I guess, training PLO operatives in how to use bombs, etc., the information they had learned and skills they had learned while in the CIA, all at high fee. I would add to your concern, or to your general question, by saying also the number of CIA agents that now work for foreign governments is a little frightening. Many former retired CIA officials are served, for example, there's a fellow in Ray Close, who was the station chief in Saudi Arabia, who retired after a long and successful career in the CIA. He was a very highly skilled man, apparently, and who became then hired on to the Saudi government in charge of, as a consultant to internal security, or foreign security for the, or just general security for the Saudi government. Well, that's sort of prostitution, it seems to me. You know, and one of the things you see in foreign, many foreign countries openly advertise for retired National Security Agency officials, men who monitor communications intelligence, to go to work in their communications facilities overseas. So we have a very, very serious erosion of not only technology, but also manpower. And it does raise questions, and the BriefingGate story has disappeared, but I suggest to you that it's too bad it did, because I think there probably was more to it.
New York City, good morning.
Good morning. First thing, I'd like to congratulate Mr. Hersh on his book there, because I do have the book, and I do find it very interesting.
Sir, let me
a lot of my suspicions in the past.
Caller, let me ask you a couple questions. Have you read the book in its entirety?
No, I just got it 2 weeks ago, and I'm going through it very slow and very carefully, and I'm not missing anything in between.
Do you normally read a book this size from cover to cover?
No.
What have you learned so far?
Well, I learned a lot that, in my opinion, that I think a lot of this was set up back in the Eisenhower-Nixon era, and it followed right on through, right up to the present. And it's still going on today with the Reagan, Carter, and administration, as well as the Ford administration.
When you say going on, what is it that's going on?
Well, I find that, for instance, an article appeared in New York News yesterday on page 7 or 8, which Nixon and Kissinger confirmed one another in a hotel in New York here, a secret meeting about the policy on South America. And I find that there's been no deviation, because Kissinger had his hand in the administration all the way around the clock, from Eisenhower right on up to the present. And like, there's a lot of dirty tricks being pulled, and the public doesn't know about it. And the most important fact is that Rockefeller refused the presidency, vice presidency under Nixon, but he accepted it under Ford. And everybody knows that Rockefeller wanted to become president of the United States, and there's something hidden behind there. Another fact that I find very interesting, that Nixon told Ford who shot Kennedy. And
where'd you find that?
That was on the television at that time there, when the news media brought it out with the transition of power at when Ford was being elected, being nominated for president of the United States. And there's a lot of small little things that add up. But I find that we're being set up for another Vietnam crisis, but it doesn't indicate what part of the world, whether it be South America or South Africa, but we are being set up.
Okay, thanks for the call. Let me ask you about that meeting in New York. I don't think it could have been secret. They had pictures in the paper yesterday, the Kissinger Nixon lunch at a French restaurant up there. Why would Mr. Kissinger do something like this at this point, 9 years after Watergate?
He's moving. He's once again trying to, I'm guessing, it's my speculations, maybe a shade 1 millimeter better than anybody else's, I really don't know. Let's start off by saying I don't know. My guess is he's touching all the right points, the tickets, punching the tickets for the right. In other words, Nixon still held in a great deal of, with a great deal of respect by many people in the Reagan camp. He still talks to the president. There's still some conferring that goes on. And I think it's just a point to show that he's going to be a good boy.
You mentioned that you did a lot of work on the, the Turple situation,
Right.
Wilson over in the Gaddafi regime. The Chad thing is all over the front page. Is that something to worry about?
Oh, yeah, it's terrifyingly stupid to go jump into the middle of a crazy, long-standing war without any, what the Army chief
For
is...
us.
Yeah. Well, for what reason? First of all, the French have a long-time commitment in there. And what you want to do is support the French. And so that we're working around the French, And secondly, I don't want to get into too much detail because suffice to say that we've put a lot of, we've now beefed up our forces in the Sudan, and we're going to use that as a staging area. Well, the fellow in Sudan, the mayor, he's got his own problems. He's got a north-south problem just like they have in Chad. There's tremendous polarization inside his own country.
Are you worried about Gaddafi?
Yeah. I don't think Gaddafi's quite the madman everybody else does. I think that's much too simple-minded. I think Gaddafi's very shrewd, much more popular than people want to believe, particularly in northern Africa.
San Antonio, you're on with Cy Hersh. Good morning.
Hello, my name is Bob Reagan, and I got 1,000 different things I want to talk about, but just to really simplify it, since we've talked about good, bad, and indifferent presidents, I'd like to ask both of you to comment on this. Do you think there'll ever be another Teddy Roosevelt? Do you think we'll ever have another president that will be strong and won't back down, whether it be South Africa or Central America or whatever the danger, whether it be communism or whatever, that we're going to, because we were a country that were built on pride and power, but it seems like our country, especially since the bomb was dropped, it's like we've diminished in our authority, we've diminished in our integrity, we've diminished in every area, and it's like I think people are tired of hearing the rhetoric. Sure, we got all the ships and everything right now in Central America, and I believe in Reagan, but then he's scrutinized by the press and everybody. I'm sure now he don't know what he's going to do.
Okay, thanks. It's a broad question, but the gentleman suggesting that Teddy Roosevelt was
the Rough Rider, the idea that, we're going to go, I'll tell you how profoundly I disagree with you, sir. It seems to me that we're in better shape than we, the fact that we have so many doubts about our overseas adventures, to me, is a plus. Because if you somehow think that we can get, if you think we came out of Vietnam with anything, in terms of heightened self-respect, I don't think you did. I think we started something we couldn't finish. And the fact is that in this world right now, with everybody, every major power with access to nuclear weapons, we don't have the ultimate terror we did. It's a different world, and we have to behave differently. And we can't send our troops into Nicaragua like we did in the 20s and 30s. If you remember, FDR pulled out the Marines out of Nicaragua in 33 when he became president. I don't think we can do it anymore. I think we're going to have to learn that there are a lot of things in the world that we're not going to like, and we're going to have to live with. And I think one way to get rid of some of that energy is maybe to devote more time and more attention to improving conditions for all of us inside this country, which is a wonderful country. We live in the best country in the world. I still think, for all your talk about the diminished United States, those people leaving Vietnam on boats, where do they want to go? They're all, paddling. Their dream is to get to where? To, to Louisiana or Florida. I don't see anybody heading for Moscow. It seems to me we have a great country with a great tradition. And I think we lose nothing by deciding that we can't be the policeman of the world, and that there are other people with other aspirations, and we don't have to put our nose in everywhere. We don't have to put our nose in Chad. We can try and restrain Gaddafi. We can put every pressure we want. But we simply can't be responsible for everything, and we don't have to see everything in terms of the Russians are doing one thing, so we have to do the other thing. That is just lunacy.
Price of Power, Kissinger and the Nixon White House is the book, and the author is with us for the next 10 minutes, Cy Hersh. Let's go back to Manhattan. Good morning.
Brian, how you doing?
Good, how are you?
Okay, my name is Brian also.
Good, good name.
Yes, it's one of the best.
With an I or a Y?
I, with an I.
Good for you.
I've been watching you and the rest of the staff, and congratulations like everybody else. I think you're probably one of the most excellent programs on TV, most unbiased and fair-handed programs. I watched McNeil Lerner last night on television, a very, very interesting program. They were interviewing three of President Reagan's advisors to El Salvador, including the president of Project Hope. During the interview, the fact came out that he asked if we were getting a fair press here. The head of Project Hope stated that the press in this country is very biased, liberal biased. He said, as far as he could see, and he's been over there in El Salvador and South America for 25 years now, as doing charitable works and very good works. He says there certainly is a communist threat, there certainly is a danger, and the reason that people are not aware of it is because of the biased reporting by the liberal press, who has distorted the facts, and so that the American people really don't know what's going on.
Caller, do you think the press is biased?
I think that the press is not only biased, I believe that they spike stories that would show, for instance, conservative thinking in a good light. I think that they constantly pick up on stories. I think they serve communism. I think that the liberal press, I don't say that they are communists, but I think they serve the cause of communism. This gentleman from Project Hope and one of the other advisors said that what the journalists seem to do here, the ones that were brainwashed in the liberal schools of journalism, what they do here is they simply listen to what the left in El Salvador has to say, and then they report it. They don't talk about, for instance, the death squads of the left. They don't talk about what the communist Castro and Russia's purpose really is over there. I think we've been fooled for 20 years. I think we lost the Vietnam War because of gentlemen like Mr. Hersh and Bella Abzug and Jane Fonda, and they got all the glory, and they were put on the front page of the Times. And I think we lost the propaganda war in Vietnam.
Let me ask you a question. May I interrupt? Let me ask you a question. Ronald Reagan's administration last week, I think the week before last, just made a big wheat sale to the Soviet Union.
All right.
A multi-million-dollar wheat sale.
Fine.
What's he doing?
Okay, I'll tell you what he's doing. You see, this was another one that was blown out of proportion by the liberal press. Mr. Reagan sat down and realized in a very practical way that the embargo of wheat simply did not work, that Russia simply went to other countries and acquired the wheat that they needed, and the only real good that the wheat embargo did, it just hurt the farmers here, and it was bad for this country. So he made a policy decision to sell wheat to Russians. That doesn't mean he's feeding the Russian army or any of the nonsense that the press... He made a practical, smart decision.
Okay, hold it right there.
Reagan could save this country from... I think that the left for 20, 30 years in this country has been putting a wedge between the American people, confusing the American people, and as far as I'm concerned, I think they champion communism.
Okay,
but the contradiction is just so clear. I mean,
maybe.
Well, no, I'm just asking you, if there really are enemies, why do you sell wheat to them?
Well, because it's practical for us to do so, because it's in our best interest to sell wheat to them, because there's wheat sitting there going bad, and there's farmers that are having a very difficult time making ends meet, and it was just a smart move for us to sell wheat to them. And if we did not sell wheat to them, we would not bring Russia to its knees because we didn't sell wheat. They'd go to France, they'd go to other countries, as they have been doing, and they'd get the wheat anyway.
Why do you think so many other countries deal with Russia? If there's a communist threat, don't they understand the communist threat?
I don't think that most of the world understands the communist threat, and the reason I don't think they understand the communist threat is because of the biased reporting in journalism in most of the other countries, including England, France, and so on and so forth. It's also very interesting, of course, that all of these countries, a lot of these countries that went socialist, are stepping away from that, are realizing that socialism is a failed philosophy, does not work, as liberalism has failed in this country. And I think that a lot of the people, if they had the facts, if the press would start reporting accurately what's really going on in El Salvador, what's really going on in Nicaragua, that the people would be behind Reagan 100%.
Okay. You know, let me ask you something. Excuse me, Brian. Let me interrupt a second. You know, in Europe, most of the European countries are more afraid of us than they are of the Soviet Union.
Of course they are. The press is to blame for that.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. Let me approach it a different way, because this is not an unusual call, and you've heard it before from the conservative side. If you were a conservative, what would you think of the press?
I think the press is terribly predictable, and I think Reagan's getting a reasonably good press. I think the White House can complain bitterly about Latin America, but by and large, Reagan's got a very good press. Reporters like him. He has good rapport. I think the notion that the press is the press basically eats anything, eats its own. I mean, ask George McGovern. He was chewed up worse by the press than anybody. For all of the biases in the press, they're very easily made captive. That's what my book basically is about on another level, too. It's about the manipulation of the press. And I just think the problem you have is that it's awfully hard to explain to somebody or try to argue with somebody who says every problem is the problem of the liberal press. Nothing's going to make the fact that it seems to me that the Soviets have not a great investment in Central America go away. And that's simply a fact that sits there. And if the White House had some evidence to the contrary, we would all know it. The fact is they don't. The fact is it's been a shell game for 3 years, and it's getting increasingly apparent. What scares me about Central America is that Reagan's model is the fact the Falklands War and Mrs. Thatcher's victory in the Falklands. And I think what you're seeing now in the next 6 months is going to be the direct politicization of the Central American War. It's going to become an adjunct to re-election, which scares the hell out of me.
Last call for Cy Hersh on this interesting morning. Palmdale, California. Good morning.
Hello. I was just wanted to say that Mr. Hersh was so upset about the overthrow of the communist leader in Chile that I don't think that he realizes the communist threat. And I was just wondering if you think communism is a threat to the world. They determined, they said themselves, to take over the world, and they've almost done it. They've infiltrated every government and country in the world so far and taken over many. And news media, left-wingers such as Hersh, are tearing this country apart, instead of getting behind our president like they should, so we can wipe up the communists in a hurry. Now, there's a new line they're getting out about the president. First, he was a good guy. He was only a good guy, a real good guy and a good actor. But he was really no good. And now they got new lies saying, been repeated over and over, and especially by Sam Donaldson and this man, that Reagan isn't too bright.
Okay.
And I like his comments on that.
Thank you, and we have about 30 seconds.
Well, the only point I can say is I think the communists are terrified of us, I mean the Soviet Union. And I think, as for Allende, I think the point I'm making about Allende was he was elected by the people. It was a democratic election in Chile. And I don't think there's much we can do when people vote the way they want to vote. I don't think that's our business. And I think we can coexist with the Soviet Union. I don't think there's any real problem in that. I don't think the Soviet, they're not coming to California tomorrow. But, look, I'll never convince you and you'll never convince me, but we both have a right to say what we want. And I absolutely grant you your right.
Because Cy Hersh is controversial and wanted you to have a chance to talk in depth with him, we stayed away from the newspapers this morning, but not tomorrow. Get your newspapers out. We want to go to the headlines. This is the book, The Price of Power, Kissinger in the Nixon White House. Also, Mr. Hersh writes for this magazine, The Atlantic, and this particular issue, The Pardon, Nixon, Ford, Haig, and the Transfer of Power. And our show's time's up, and we hope that you'll come back sometime and continue this discussion.
Bloodied but not unbowed.
Cy Hersh. Have a nice day. Book, as a matter of fact. Expensive book. What's this retail?
$19.95, but in the modern day world it could have been more. I ended up taking a smaller commission on each book to get the price under $20, because it priced out at if anybody cares, it priced out at around $22, $23, which everybody said that's too expensive for. You can't sell serious books these days. So what Crown Books and some of the discount bookstores sell it for $12, $13, which is almost a rational price.
Among other things, you currently are writing for this magazine on a regular basis. This is the August issue of The Atlantic, The Pardon, Nixon, Ford, Haig, and the Transfer of Power. What's so far been the most important impact that you think this book has had on the political process, if any?
Well, certainly I didn't know when I started I'd end up being an employment agency for Henry Kissinger. I mean, that certainly wasn't the goal. And if you think I'm happy about it, I'm not. I'm very upset that Reagan would, in the face of a book, for all the criticism of the book, it mostly is personal. It's a, you know, the criticism has to do with whether I did a hatchet job, whether I'm obsessed with Henry Kissinger, whether I should be spending my time doing other things, and not. Nobody's ever gone in and taken a chapter and opened it up and said, I'm wrong, or talked to the people I talked with and get them to acknowledge that I was misquoting them. So there's no question that there's some serious issues that I've raised in the book. And then for Reagan, about morality, about integrity, about what the secret policy was. And for Reagan to come back and reappoint him says an awful lot. Is it anti-intellectual? Is it sort of sticking it? Or is it the fact that hell, if Henry Kissinger can sell Richard Nixon's foreign policy as well as he obviously did, maybe he can sell mine. I think it must be a lot of that. He needs a good salesman. I think the most important thing in the book, as I've been, you know, flogging this book for a couple of months. It's been published in June, and I've been talking on talk shows and doing things. I didn't write this, but it's finally come to me the way I should have described what they really tried to do, Nixon and Kissinger. I think it was the most serious attempt at our Constitution in our history. I think these two guys were bringing everything into the White House. Somewhere in one of Kissinger's in Nixon's memoirs, RN, for those who have it at home, page 600, he has a diary entry in the middle of the Vietnam War. And it's 72, and they're trying to negotiate a settlement in Vietnam. You remember there was a Christmas bombing, there was all this agony, all this angst, and he has Haig coming in, Kissinger's off negotiating in Moscow. This is in April. And Nixon's mad at Kissinger, as he always was by 72. They ended up being terrible enemies. And they still are, although they had lunch the other day together. I mean, they hate each other. But, you know, they both developed into our finest actors. I mean, they're both wonderful actors, Nixon and Kissinger. They defeat anything much better than anything we have in Hollywood. They're two consummate actors. Both deserve all sorts of Oscars. But anyway, the point of it is, on page 600, there's a diary entry. Nixon has this diary that he taped. He didn't transcribe regularly, but eventually he got them all transcribed for his memoirs. And the entry goes on like this. There's an issue up for debate about what they're going to negotiate with the North Vietnamese. And Haig comes in, and Haig says, Mr. President, above all, no matter what happens, we must do something that keeps you in office. You know, there it is. You rarely see it so clearly. Just sitting there like a lump, which is, you know, when I saw it, I went manna, because by that time, that's it. That's the whole game.
Cy Hersh, author, journalist, becoming one of the more loved and hated of the national journalists. Does it bother you when somebody really, I mean, we're going to get calls this morning, I guarantee you, that people don't like you. Does that bother you? Or do you think that's part of the game?
Yeah, well, I did the My Lai stuff, and I did the My Lai massacre stuff in 70 or 69 when I wrote about the massacre of all those Vietnamese civilians and children. What bothered me were the calls for about 3 months. Anytime a bunch of Special Forces guys got together at one of the bars down in Georgia or somewhere and had a few beers while they got to the payphone, I'm enlisted, called me up and told me what they were going to do to my private parts. And so after that didn't get me nervous as much as it did my wife. And no, I don't like it. I don't like. I weep and moan at all the, I get some wonderfully nasty reviews. Some are very funny. In fact, we know they were taking all of the authority away. Their real enemies were not the Chinese or the Russians with whom they could cut deals, but their Secretary of Defense, you know, Mel Laird, and their Secretary of State, Bill Rogers. And the goal was to bring all the power in there. We know Nixon, when he was knocked down because of Watergate, was in the process of setting up his apparatchiks in every cabinet. If you remember that, Fred Malloch was running some sort of a program designed to get a certain kind of personnel in every cabinet and every executive regulatory agency, etc. I think the goal was almost total control, and I think his legacy was going to be his heir was going to be John Connally, and I think Nixon's goal was to go out and have a $40 million a year law practice and be able to fix anything for anybody anywhere in the world. Well. We won't know the whole story of some of the money manipulations because I couldn't find it. I could find it, but I couldn't write it. I mean, I was too jittery about it. I had a wonderful book on foreign policy, but I learned a lot. The pardon story, for example, is something I learned in doing interviews. I did more than 1,000 interviews for this book, and I learned that there was no way Richard Nixon thought he was ever going to jail. He knew, you know, what Jerry Ford was and who Jerry Ford was. We just don't always.
Let me interrupt just to ask you, and I read the Atlantic story yesterday, and I wondered, Why would somebody like former President Ford talk to you when he knows undoubtedly where you're coming from on this thing? Why would he sit down and he gave you an interview, what, out in Rancho Mirage or someplace?
Yeah, well, I think he initially did not want to. He was talked into it by friends who said, you know, my God, you've got to see him. He initially said he's just going to. I think it was wise for him to talk to me because at least I'm right there saying he denies what he denies. I certainly didn't learn anything I didn't expect to learn, but I thought it was important. I think it's important for a former. I think they have an obligation to talk to people like me and escape. You know, Richard Nixon certainly wouldn't deign to see me, or doesn't deign to see very many people he doesn't think are friendly. Henry Kissinger didn't even deign to respond to a request for an interview. You know, the utter contempt with which my requests were cheated.
In a way, though, doesn't it help you in the sense of, you know, it's easier for you to say now, Mr. Kissinger won't see me, he won't talk to me, and there's a confrontation there. Seymour Hersh, author of The Price of Power. This morning's newspapers are full of stories about the Kissinger Commission on Central America meeting for the first time yesterday. What chances for success do you give it?
Well, you have to hope, of course, as any American would, that they come up with something wonderful. I think my experience has shown me that Henry Kissinger is ultimately a toady, and I think he's a very safe appointment. He's going to give you what you want. If Reagan wants a very tough, rattling the sabers of communists and geopolitical talk in Central America, he's going to get it. If Reagan wants an out, if he decides politically he needs a vehicle to get out, he can get a forward-looking report that says it's time to disengage. It all depends on what the boss wants. Whatever the boss wants, Henry Kissinger will deliver, is the general rule based on my experience. He could surprise us all. He could do something, you know, honest and with integrity. I don't think it's my experience. There's not very much in him. It's also my experience that his appointment, I think, is a message to the people of Central America and Latin America. Here's the man who basically in Latin America is viewed as the guy who brought down Allende, when Allende's crime in their eyes, his basic crime was not as political Marxism or socialism, but the fact they viewed us as being upset about the fact that he was elected by the people. A socialist was elected. He's the man who helped Nixon bring down Allende, and his chief deputy, Mr. Schlotterman, was a deputy chief of mission for the American embassy in Chile, Santiago, in 1970, at the time when we know from the Senate Intelligence Committee that there were, from an official report, that there were serious plans to have a military overthrow. So it's a terrible message to give to people. But it's very hard to read Henry Kissinger. My own private guess is he could even do something with Castro. He may pull a rabbit out of the hat. Anything is possible.
Seymour Hersh was born in Chicago, Illinois in 1937. Married, has 3 children. Spent 4 years researching and writing The Price of Power, Kissinger in the White House. This book, very big, thicker, that develops.
Well, I wish he had seen me because, you know, he likes to talk. You know, he's really his own worst enemy. His memoirs were my interviews. He has these 2 very fat memoirs. One of the things I allege in this Atlantic piece is that there was serious talk about bringing out the 82nd Airborne in the weeks before Nixon resigned. Al Haig was going around talking about the 82nd Airborne.
And you mentioned something about one of was it the chairman of the Joint Chiefs or one of the chiefs thought he heard in a discussion they were going to do that?
Well, one of the chiefs, after a meeting with Nixon in the December of '73, walked out of that meeting convinced that Nixon was giving him the high sign to do something, you know, that he was talking about, I'm your last hope. The Eastern liberal establishment, you know, are going to, those Jews in the East, they're going to run us over, and it's going to be the end of the programs you're for, good conservative, tough programs. We're going to be overrun by the left. And he thought he detected a high sign. That may have been in his own mind. He asked Jim Schlesinger, who was then the Secretary of Defense, and Schlesinger didn't hear it. But Schlesinger later was among those very alarmed when there was talk about the 82nd Airborne. And do you know where you find proof of that? It's amazing. You find proof of it in none other than Kissinger's memoirs. You know, he wrote 3,000 pages. A lot of people bought it. Nobody read it. I have the same feeling about my book. You know, people buy it, but it's hard to read.
Have you found anybody that's read it cover to cover?
Yeah. You know, my wife. You know, no, I don't find... I'm very disappointed in newspaper reviews, and I don't know why I shouldn't be. I've been generally treated very favorably by the press. I really have been. I have no complaint. given Kissinger's status. But they really don't, you know, I was press secretary for G. McCarthy when he ran against Lyndon Johnson. One of McCarthy's lines that always struck me as very apt, funny but also more apt than people realize. He said, the trouble with you reporters is, he said, is you write but you don't read. And we do have that. I mean, there's not enough, it seems to me, thoughtful stuff that goes on in the media, which makes it possible for a guy like me to make money. And the point I'm making is that somewhere in the middle of his second volume, towards the end of Kissinger's second volume of Memoirs, I think Years of Upheaval, he describes a meeting in which Haig says we're going to have to bring out the 82nd Airborne to protect the president. And he writes about how we thought he was upset, et cetera, et cetera. Kissinger told Haig, whatever, you know, who can believe that? But I certainly can believe the first part. And it's pretty amazing stuff.